Hello and welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler, and today we're talking about
relationships, pretty much. All the ways in which we conceive of them and the obligations that we feel and how partners place stresses upon each other, but also provide, the complement, sometimes we say life partner, or we might even say the person who's intended for us. All of those sorts of things we're going to be circling around today.
Yeah, and it's going to be a little bit of a grab bag here, but I think it's a very important topic that we are going to try to dive into a little bit.
Yeah, and as we were kicking the idea around and thinking about how to title this, part of what we were after was the notion that when we're in a relationship, whether it's a good relationship or a bad relationship, there's always more than just two partners who are, say, in a contract or making demands on each other. It's not a purely mercenary exchange. There's something in the relationship itself that comes to take on a life of its own. And it could be good or it could be bad or a mixture of both, depending on what people are bringing to it and how they're conceiving of it and whether they're on the same page with what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And, I think if you're looking at your relationship in a purely market or transactional basis, then I think you're on a pretty, rocky sandy foundation for the basis of that relationship.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use that metaphor of the foundation. Sand is no foundation at all, right? Descartes uses that idea in his discourse on method, and he says that all these other philosophies in his time were based on sand, and so that's not bad until something comes along to disturb things, and then suddenly your foundation is gone. And he wanted to build on rock, and I think we could transpose that idea into relationships. So this is actually a great place to start. You mentioned people having a sort of transactional view of their relationships that, I give in order to get. Why is that a unsuitable foundation?
Because, I was looking up the, different types of economies, and it really brought me to this idea of the sharing economy, because the dichotomy here is that I'm giving something in a market economy that's very transactional. I'm giving something of material value in order to gain something of material value. It's always this back and forth about what I can give or I can get. But in an idea of a sharing economy, you have this thing where you're giving out things in order to try to build relationships. You're giving it without the obligation of getting something back. You are getting, you're trying to hit that idea of reciprocity, but that idea of reciprocity is the thing that builds those relationships. And you can have a market economy as well with the sharing economy, but the sharing economy is the thing that builds a relationship in and of itself.
Yeah, I think that's completely right, to be able to make, and we don't necessarily have to use those terms, to be able to make a distinction between two different modes of looking at things. And there are some relationships, I think, in which it's perfectly appropriate for us to have a very hard-nosed, I'm not going to put stuff into this if I'm not going to get stuff out, like business relationships, right? Or when we're first starting out in some sort of relationship with our neighbors, it's nice to invite people over and cook them some food or offer them some drinks. But if they don't reciprocate, they're not coming over very often after that, right? If they never hold up their end. But there's you might say there's certain thresholds within personal relationships where if we do look at it in a market sense, however we want to describe that perspective, we're going to cut ourselves off from possibilities for growing in that relationship. We're going to make the other person at some point in time feel like they're just being used or valued only in terms of what they're putting on the table, at that point for us, and we're going to screw things up. It's not to say that, finances don't matter or we shouldn't demand some sort of reciprocity on the part of our partner that could be measured, but we can't just be in that. And I think there's a lot of people who do look at their relationships that way, or there's relationships in which one partner doesn't see it that way and the other partner does see it that way, and those end up being bad relationships. Now, here's an interesting question. Are those bad relationships for both of them, or are those bad relationships just for the person who wants it to be something more, but not a bad relationship for the person who wants to keep it purely transactional? What do you think?
I think it's bad for both, just because there's a fundamental mismatch of what the other is expecting from it.
Okay.
And so, both the person that wants it transactional is put upon by the other person that wants more, as well as the one that wants more is feeling like their affections or whatever are being rebuffed because the other person doesn't want that. It just, you want to have some sort of simpatico equality in what you're expecting from that relationship in the first place.
Yeah. I was just reading Cicero's On Friendship, this book that he wrote that's very relevant today for producing some lecture videos for my classes on it. And one of the topics that he talks about is these wrong-headed ideas about friendships that were quite common back in ancient times. And one of them was precisely this, that you should only exhibit goodwill, which is benevolentia in Latin. You should only exhibit goodwill to the degree that the other person exhibits goodwill. So you should kind of, tailor it or what would you say, measure it according to that. And Cicero says, well, this is a terrible idea because it treats friendship as if it's purely what we would nowadays call transactional. And it's based on it's sort of like a idea that everything is a zero-sum game, that if I give more, I'm getting screwed or I'm getting cheated and I can't get back. And Cicero says, look, affection is not like that. It's not as if by giving more generously, and he uses this example of measures like pouring grain into measures. He says, listen, if a little bit overflows, that's perfectly fine. It's not going to go to waste, and if you're measuring with instead of rounding it off right at the top and making sure that it's like completely even, if you allow there to be a little bit more on top, that's going to be fine. And I think that when we don't do that, when we don't give a little bit more than is expected or required, over time that erodes the relationship. And so a good relationship, like you're saying, is part of a sharing economy, right?
And so you brought up a zero-sum game, and that makes me think about that mode of thinking within game theory and the idea of relationships as positive-sum games, and that that we are.
That you have to explain a little bit, I think.
Okay, so a zero-sum game is we're playing chess or something, and there's only, I guess, three outcomes. Either I win and you lose, you win, I lose, or we're a stalemate. But there's no other way of doing that. You can't have both people win. In a positive-sum game, the point is not to win, but to continue playing the game, because everyone benefits from playing the game. And so in a relationship, having a positive-sum game is that the relationship in and of itself is a good that cannot be found outside of that relationship, and that if you look at the whole host of like what it is to have a good life or a eudaimonic life or flourishing life, a lot of them require you to have good, strong relationships. You look at Aristotle; he says that you have to have a good life. You have to have those good relationships, and I would rather have a life with lots of good relationships than one solitude and by myself.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, in ancient philosophy, and also this ran throughout medieval and a lot of early modern philosophy, there is that realization that without some kinds of good relationships, and they have different ways of conceiving or defining them, our lives are lacking. And going back to Cicero's on friendship, which is taking off from Aristotle, but going beyond it, he actually draws out this connection between moral virtue or excellence, however we want to understand it, good character traits and friendship. And he says that even people who don't value good character traits recognize that they want friendship. They may not enjoy it completely because they make themselves unable to be a good friend, but they can recognize that this is something that they would like to have, almost counterfactually, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
If they weren't the kind of person who can't be a decent friend, they would want to have a friend. And, you're right. Aristotle says that it's not enough just to be a good person, to have good character. We also need to have relationships. Cicero goes even further and says, maybe the relationships themselves are even more important than moral virtue, which is an interesting idea. And I don't think that he's pushing that consistently throughout his works, but he is putting it in the mouth of somebody else because it's a dialogue. So, but I think that really is an idea he's entertaining there. And I think a lot of people do that. We don't have to be completely perfect people in order to have good, sustaining relationships, whether they're friendships or, romantic partnerships with a spouse or boyfriend, girlfriend, whoever, or even, at a sort of like a less intimate level, neighbors, people like that. And then, we've got all the relationships within the family that we might think about, which are often quite, they change over time and they can often be quite difficult. Think about sibling rivalry, right?
And that brings up I think we touched on this a little bit last week, but the whole point of either loyalty or doing what is right, and you have to kind of choose which value you value the most. And I feel like that's one of the things about relationships, that it because we get so close, especially to our spouses, that sometimes it gets really muddled about at what point in time do you if they've done something very, very bad, do you turn them in? If they cheat on their taxes, do you turn them in when it's your friend or your family? Probably not. But there's
they murdered somebody,
murders. And I brought up in our notes on Macbeth and the story of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth and how she's goading him in order to kill King Duncan. And he does it because that's his wife, that's his closest relationship, and he seems to value that more than anything else.
Yeah, again, bringing up Cicero an awful lot in this book on friendship, but it's really quite good. One of the things that he talks about early on are these demands of loyalty, and whether a good friend would ask us to do something wrong, and what we ought to do when they do that. And then towards the end of the book, he also talks about how to criticize friends. And he tells us that this is actually a very necessary thing. And he's not being sort of, he's not saying we should be passive aggressive about this or, look for opportunities to criticize people. He just thinks that within the course of human relationships, being the kinds of not entirely finished products that we are, morally speaking, we are going to screw up. And we need our friends, he says, not just to warn us or to advise us. The Latin term for that could mean either, but also to tell us that we got things wrong. And then he gives some advice for how do you do that? And he says, well, you need to avoid insult on the one hand, and you should also avoid harshness. The word that he uses there, it could be transliterated as asperity, right? Which is kind of a dryness or harshness. And he really thought that this was something that people need to pay attention to. And I think he's completely right. In our own life, if you're the kind of person who can't take criticism, in some ways, you can't be a good friend or a good lover or a good spouse, because you're continually keeping people at a distance that prevents not just growth on your part, which would be good, but also genuine intimacy. But it sucks to get criticized, right? It's no fun.
Yeah. I absolutely agree that, for a actual good, strong relationship, you should be very open with how you see the other person. And a mark of, I guess, personal development and a good relationship is that you are able to take those things without feeling like you are being attacked.
What if you are being attacked, though? What if you have a partner who's not fully developed and is using it as an opportunity to try to control or dominate you or humiliate you to make themselves feel good?
Then I think you have larger problems than just
yeah, and Cato, it's Scipio who gets mentioned in there. No, it is Cato. I'm going back and forth, oscillating between these.
I assume the younger, correct?
Yeah, and Cato complained, and Cicero records this, about people who only learn the truth of themselves from their enemies, who say how things actually are and criticize them on that basis in a spirit of malice or ill will. Mm-hmm. And they don't learn who they are from their friends, because their friends are unwilling to tell them the things about themselves that need to be challenged or changed. And he says these people are really in a bad situation, because they're not going to listen to their enemies. They hate the enemies, and they're the people who should be helping them by gently informing them of what they need to change or what they need to at least take a look at won't do it for them. So what do you think? Is there an obligation to?
I don't think any of your friends should be sycophants, to just be yes men to your ideas. And I actually had a personal experience with this, where I had a friend who I was like, I had to give some blatant, or not blatant, but blunt experience of how I was experiencing our relationship and some of the things that he was doing within it.
Yeah.
And he responded in a very angry way, because I was, I guess, telling him the way that I saw the things, and I tried to put it in a kind way, but I wasn't trying to say you're doing perfectly fine. And at that point in time, it really became apparent that I needed to end this relationship. That this was the person that, at least at this point in time, is not the person that I could have as a full confidant and treat with the respect that I felt like I should be giving a friend.
Yeah, and that points towards another factor that is identified early on in ancient literature connected with friendship. We feel affection or desire towards people quite quickly, but that by itself isn't the basis for friendship or a romantic relationship. It takes time to develop intimacy in a sense of where we can go and where we can't go. Aristotle has this proverb that he takes from earlier authors about needing to consume a barrel of salt together. Now, he doesn't mean like a giant, 50-gallon drum. he means like the sort of thing that would sit on your table, and you would sprinkle, a bit of salt at each meal. And the idea is you need to consume a lot of meals together in order to genuinely become friends with each other, in order to get to know the person well, because we can often be mixed up about these sorts of things. First appearances can be deceiving. We can generalize too much from single instances, and so this is something I think we'll talk about a little bit more. This development of of intimacy over time.
Yeah, first impressions are very sticking usually, and I guess I have definitely used certain markers, especially if going out to dinner and trying to
Oh, yeah.
see how they actually interact with the wait staff, because I think that's a pretty good yardstick of kind of like, okay, how does this person treat those people that could be presented as lesser than them?
Or they're in their power, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
I use that all the time in my ethics classes for my young students, and they like totally relate to it because some of them have actually worked in restaurants, or they've worked retail, and they've been on the bad end of the stick of that sort of treatment. And then I always see a couple kids in the class get thoughtful, and I'm picturing to myself that maybe they're remembering instances where somebody they know didn't treat service workers well, or maybe they're remembering their own cases where they didn't, and they're now thinking, oh man, I need to work on this sort of thing. What's going on with my assumptions and how I look at people, right?
Right. And so, I don't know, I'm going to switch tracks just a little bit and bring up the idea that you shouldn't have a partner or a relationship in order to try to fix you.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point.
That you don't need to be a perfect person in perfect mental health to have good relationships, but the idea is that you shouldn't be reliant upon that person to be the one that is fixing you. That you shouldn't be using your partner as something to fill in your own holes. You should be there to complement that person and not the other.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think a lot of people get themselves into trouble because we're kind of driven by this lack within ourselves, and then we get all these cultural messages that whether they come from music or magazine spreads or movies, or pick whatever you like in our popular culture that portrays this as central to relationships. People, oh, you complete me, that whole line. Well, the person might complete you, but the completed thing might actually be a monstrosity. Maybe you kind of belong together because you're both messed up, but sort of like imagine like Legos that have been warped by heat or something like that. They fit together, but it's a terrible composition and it won't fit in with anything else. So that's one thing. And then a lot of times people, they get into relationships, and I know I've had this experience myself. You're very excited at the beginning of it. You feel like the person is completing you in some way, and that lasts for a month or two, and then suddenly you realize that there's things about them that you really don't like, and they may be things about yourself that you also don't like as well. So it's not as perfect as the honeymoon phase portrayed it as being. And I think there's a lot of other problems with this notion that we want the other person to like fill in all the gaps within ourselves. There's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah, and related is this idea that you shouldn't have your happiness be dependent upon your partner. This is kind of a very similar idea.
Why is that a bad idea?
Because then your happiness is outside of your own control. That your mood will be contingent upon potentially your partner's mood or something along those lines.
But I mean, if we want to play devil's advocate here, shouldn't you care about your relationship with your partner and how they feel and what's going on with them? Isn't that a sign that they matter to you, that affects you?
I don't think those two things are in conflict at all.
How so?
Because
that's good. No, you're right.
Yeah,
but
because to put it as a dichotomy and set it up like that is a false dichotomy. I don't. I can care about my partner's happiness and whatnot, but if I can't be happy just because my partner is happy, then I feel like that's a failing upon yourself.
It's interesting. As you were talking about that, I was thinking about like partners who want their partners to, they would say empathize with them or commiserate with them, but they really want their partners to be angry with them at the same people. They come home and they talk about how their boss is a jerk and their coworkers are awful and, the bus ride or whatever it's going to be. And the right response is, yeah, those SOBs, who were they to do that to you, right? Mm-hmm. That's not actually a good dynamic, though. And, I was also thinking, too, Aristotle, in discussing friendship, and I think this applies to other relationships as well, he says that one of the key traits of it is that we share in the other person's joys and we share in their sorrows. And he uses those two emotional modalities. And I think there's probably something to that. If I tell you that, which I will be doing eventually, that one of my pets has died and I'm really sad about it, and you don't, and you're just like, well, death comes to us all. I'm not going to view you as sharing in my sorrow. Obviously, I don't want you like tearing your beard out and rending your clothes like they did in the ancient.
Gnashing my teeth.
Exactly. That would be crazy and excessive and actually a little scary. But we expect there to be some sort of reaction. So is there how do what are the right sorts of empathizing or even sympathizing in the sense of feeling the same thing without falling into what some of the philosophers call emotional contagion? You get angry at I don't know, some perceived offense, and I'm like, oh, I can't believe they did that to Dan, and now I'm just as angry as you are. Obviously, we don't want that. Is there a line we can draw?
Well, I think the first good line is to be very, very cautious of anger and being a contagious anger.
Yeah.
Because that's going to lead you to potentially very negative outcomes that are not actually in the benefit of anyone. And I also have that experience of like, your partner wanting, coming home and just venting and like always being angry about like the same things over and over and wanting you to be angry, and it puts me into a very negative headspace where I want to commiserate with this person, but also noticing that it has a visceral effect on my my personal experience, my emotional state, that I would rather not have.
And in a way, it puts you in a bad position as far as the assumptions you have to make, right? So let's say two different partners, right? We have one who comes home and they're legitimately angry about how their boss treated them at work, and their boss really did do the wrong things. I think it would make sense to feel some anger, although not, like I'm going to, trash the apartment kind of thing about that, because you see that there's a legitimate beef there. And then maybe you're like, well, it doesn't actually help to get angry in this case. Let's sort of sit down and figure out what we can do. Maybe you need a new boss, meaning you need a new workplace. And then there's the one who comes in and they are angry about things, but the stuff that they're angry about is unreasonable. They took offense when they didn't need to take offense, and they blew things out of proportion. And if you're supposed to like go down their path, that means that you have to take on mistaken assumptions, and sort of, it's almost like you have to do like you have to overcome the cognitive dissonance of saying to yourself, this is unreasonable, in order to be able to say, I totally agree with you. And then, you're worse off in part, not just because you're angry, but because you're angry about stuff that doesn't matter, that stuff that isn't true. You disalign yourself with the true, the right, the good, in order to fit in better with your partner. And you could say, well, maybe that's the value there, right? Being in alignment with somebody who you love and care about and want to spend time with. But if they're that out of whack with reality, they're going to keep getting you more and more out of whack with reality, and that's not going to be good for either one of you, right?
Right. One of the techniques that I've found to be very useful for these situations is to ask, what do you want in this situation? Do you
Yeah.
want to vent and have a little catharsis, or do you want me to help you solve this problem? And that's the first.
Do you want me to bust up the place?
And a lot of times the what your partner just needs is to vent, but then it gets to the point of kind of a Chicken Little problem, or the boy who cried wolf, where
Okay, yeah.
if it's the same thing over and over and over, then you start to become numb to this thing, and then when something actually of consequent happens, then you have been conditioned to say, okay, yeah, it's just a thing, yeah, I feel bad for you as well, and grr to them. But now you have a mismatch between the actual necessary things that might need to be done versus what you are actually expressing to your partner.
Yeah. What do you think about some of the other emotions? So I mentioned Aristotle said we should share in the joys and share in the sorrows or sadnesses. Mm-hmm. Should we share in the sadness of things with our partners? Maybe not in every case. Like if they are seriously depressed, that doesn't mean that in order to love them, we have to become seriously depressed as well. But something bad does happen, or they're looking around at the situation that we're in, and they feel down about that. Is there some value in sharing in that with them? It's a negative emotion, right?
Mm-hmm. I think, especially in order to deal with grief,
yeah. Should we distinguish between like being down and grieving, where grief is due to loss?
Sure. Yeah, especially when we're just talking about, general malaise.
Yeah.
And maybe minor depression or something along those lines. You definitely want to maybe comfort them, but to share in someone's depression is not probably productive for anyone. But especially within grief, you've got a loss that is a one-time event usually, and then but that is something usually very emotionally jarring, that we have these strong connections to these people, and I absolutely think that relationships are a very good way to deal with these types of loss, and I absolutely agree with Aristotle there. If you want to go to other emotions like jealousy or greed or envy, then I think that's probably not going to be a good thing to share in.
Yeah. We could talk about other malice, right? Delighting in somebody else feeling pain. Maybe there's quite a few negative emotions that we wouldn't want to take on. And you do see people in relationships kind of urging each other with those, right? Kind of amplifying that, almost like a feedback loop.
Yeah, I wonder how that feels within a military context, especially if you're in active combat and you're sharing in, I guess, the delight of victory over an enemy, but it's also the little bit of that schadenfreude of that, like having happiness at the misfortune of others.
Yeah, although usually it's those others who are trying to shoot at you, so you've got a pretext for, wanting them injured or dead or taken off the field or something like that. I would also, with the military thing brings up like fear as well, sometimes raw terror, that
I guess a shared courage would be something that I would promote.
Yeah. And there we're talking more about a disposition than just an emotion, right?
But if you look at courage as like fortitude in the face of fear.
Yeah, feeling a kind of confidence, capacity to handle things. Yeah, I mean, that could be certainly amplified. That's actually a good point. There are quite a few things that we need other people to be working with us on. So thinking about a military unit, right? If you're like super soldier, whoever, we'll call him G.I. Joe, and you're the most, accomplished military person, we'll make you infantry, but you've got, the capacity to carry all sorts of heavy weapons as well, just like in video games, right? Which are totally unrealistic when it comes to this sort of stuff. We portray that person as if he's able or she's able to operate entirely on their own. But that isn't the way anything actually works in the military. You're constantly dependent on a whole train of people resupplying you and the people next to you. And if they're screw-ups, so I'll tell you kind of an interesting story that brings to mind. I was in the Army, and I went in 89, not that long before the wall came down, and we totally had to change what we were going to do because Warsaw Pact fell apart and the Soviet Union was falling apart, and that's what we were primed to do in Germany. That's what we were training for. And I was a combat engineer, which means that I did infantry stuff, and I also did demolitions and set up barriers and minefields and all sorts of really fun things to do. And there were people in our unit, and we used to call them the cheesers. And there's all sorts of names for these sorts of people. These were the guys who really didn't know their jobs very well, and they were kind of jerks, but they were really obsessed with keeping their uniform pressed and their boots, shined up, and it's sort of, they were like great picture soldiers. And they would always, kind of kiss the rear ends of whoever was in charge, but they weren't very good soldiers. And then we'd have all sorts of, other people. So a lot of these were our NCOs who were kind of grizzled and, didn't keep themselves up all that well. And there was, at that time, unfortunately, they were enjoying the dividends of peace by getting rid of a lot of people. And they were getting rid of people who were really good non-commissioned officers and writing them up over stupid things like, not having their boots shined at the proper time. And they would create a paper trail, and then they'd kick them out so they couldn't collect a pension. Some of them with 17 years of service in. Shortly after that, and they were just kicking people out like crazy. And I actually took the early out because I didn't want to be in our unit anymore, seeing what was going on. Shortly after that, Desert Shield started. Now nobody could get out. And a lot of the good people who you would want to go into combat with had been phased out. And a lot of the people who were, wonderful, you might call them guardhouse soldiers, but were not particularly good soldiers, they were in. And they were the ones who got rank. And you think to yourself, okay, if you're a combat engineer and you're in Iraq and they've got minefields, and the mines are not just regular conventional mines, but chemical mines, if one guy screws up, that's going to screw up the whole squad, right? It's potential. And unfortunately, this didn't happen that way, but we were thinking about these things. You actually, you want to have people lined up with you who are good at what they do and are properly disposed, morally speaking. You can't function by yourself doing really good things without a nexus of relationships of other decent people. And we can transpose this into business settings. We can talk about, for example, our organization, the Milwaukee Stoic Fellowship, which I think is a pretty good organization. We have people who are doing things, including yourself, right? You created the walk and talks and continued that, right? I'm really happy because then I don't have to do much leadership stuff anymore. The idea was to phase it off to other people, and you want that sort of thing. And in a relationship, obviously, you're not going to outsource your relationship duties in a relationship. That'd be nonsense. But you do need to have a partner who isn't just depending on you to be the sole provider, the sole person who's contributing good things to it, the sole support. And likewise, you don't want to be the needy one in that sense. You got to you don't have to necessarily do everything, but you have to be able to do some things competently in your relationship, right? So that we're not just codependent, to use the psychological term. And this comes back to that one thing that you started with, like needing the other person to be the complement of yourself, right? I mean, complement could be two things. It could be like, well, we do fill in the areas where even though we're striving really hard and doing everything we need to do, we're still falling short. And then there's the like, I'm a lazy person who's got huge holes in what I can do, and I go to this other person to like make me whole. One is good and one's bad, right?
Yeah, it's the idea that you should feel good helping your partner, but you shouldn't be dependent upon it. That look at as the cherry on top of your sundae. That you should have well-being within your own life, and that you shouldn't be dependent upon your partner to make sure that you have some semblance of well-being.
Yeah, I mean, there could be cases where like, okay, you get really sick. Or something else happens. You brought up depression. You're disabled by depression and grief for a while your partner is there to help support you then, right?
Right. And you hope that person is there for you and vice versa in the future.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm thinking like is not physical maladies, but like your emotional well-being, that what you find to be a flourishing life or a well-being within your life, especially in the psychological sense.
Yeah, that makes good sense.
This is also not including clinical depression and whatnot. These are outside of the scope of what I'm thinking here.
Yeah, and if you think about the sources of tensions within relationships that break things down, very often they have to do not just there's the finances, there's sex, there's whether or not like in a romantic relationship you want to have children, but I think a lot of the tensions that arise within a relationship have to do with who's giving who attention, and the nature of the relationship, whether the relationship is itself being valued or whether people are taking advantage of each other. Yeah.
So I think we need to switch gears here and talk about our question of the week.
Yeah, and this is actually a good segue because it's about finances, right?
Yeah. So I guess the main topic is, am I the jerk for making more money than my SO? Do you want to expand on that, Greg?
Sure. So we like to look around on some of the Reddit forums for these interesting questions that come up. And there is one there, and it's not actually called Am I the Jerk? We're using that as a euphemism because we're not going to say the word on the air, but you know what forum it is. And it's by a woman in her 30s who was working a bad job, and she wound up because of this crisis that we're in. She says, I was recently informed I'd have to work additional overtime to help with the influx of loans provided by the government. To top it off, I got a bonus recently on top of my raise. Plus the overtime and the stimulus checks means I have more money in my pocket than I have had in the last 2 years. I was really struggling before all this happened and had to do things on the side just to get by. My partner recently got his hours cut at his job, and we're not certain if he will have a job at the end of the month. Prior to this, he was having a lot of financial trouble. And then she goes a little bit, skipping down, she says, when I got the news I would be working overtime, my boyfriend got upset with me that I was being insensitive to him about how good I have it now and that I have all this money. I feel really alone here in not being able to share my good news with anyone, and I thought he would be happy for me considering how severely unhappy I was prior to getting this position. But the joy literally got sucked out of me, and I can't even buy something nice for myself without seeming like I'm an insensitive jerk. So then she asks, am I the jerk? And I think the answer is definitely no. What do you think, Dan?
I am in complete agreement here. And I think this really comes down to what her partner has as a preconceived conception of what his role in that relationship is. And especially within the Western world in the United States, there's been studies that say that once a woman in a relationship makes about 40% of the total income of a partner's gross income, that's a time where it starts to become a problem for the man, because there's a preconceived notion that the man is the one that's supposed to make the money to bring home the bread, and there's a cognitive disconnect that he's having between what he expects and what his reality is, and he might not even be aware of that.
Yeah, and I think we have to take those findings with some grain of salt, right? Because obviously it changes. I think generationally that changes a bit. Like if we're looking at younger people now, maybe those numbers would be a little bit lower than, say, baby boomers. But there definitely can be a lot of rancor about these sorts of issues. And I actually see a larger issue here, which is one partner suddenly doing well in some area and the other partner feeling like they're not getting to participate in that in some way, right? It makes them feel bad. So like it could be, I'll give you an example that could apply to my life. So my own wife in many respects is way more accomplished than I am when it comes to connections within all sorts of different intellectual and practical spheres. My response isn't, oh, well, now I'm somehow less because she has become, appointed to this board or, president of this or involved in this really cool project or anything like that. It's rather to say, oh, that's really great. Now, it could also be, oh, that's really great because now I don't have to do anything myself and I can just hang on her coattails. I don't have that reaction either. That would be another thing. But I think, and we do want to, we don't want to say that that's good, right? Aristotle, interestingly, Aristotle talks about a passion that he calls emulation, which is the translation of the Greek zelos that we get the word zeal from. And when you're feeling emulation, it's not the same thing as feeling envy. When you're envious, you want the other person to fail so that you don't feel bad about your own lack of success. Emulation is when you see somebody who actually deserves to be recognized for what they're doing, getting honored or something like that. And you're like, oh man, I wish that was me, but I wish I actually deserved that. Like, so when I see like a colleague write a really good book, one of my reactions is that feeling, and it's not envy. I'm like, oh man, I wish I could have written that book, but I can't because, that's not my area of specialization and they're the person to have written the book. So good for them. Right. That's actually a good response, but it seems like her boyfriend has the opposite response. Her doing well is taking away from him in some way.
Yeah, I think he's looking at this to a certain extent like a competition.
Yeah,
that there's a winner and a loser in this particular thing, and it kind of goes back to our talking about game theory earlier, the idea of a zero-sum game versus a positive-sum game, and that your partner's benefit should be your benefit, and it doesn't mean that there's anything taken away from you.
Yeah, so actually, if we want to use that, we could say there's the zero-sum game mentality on one side at one extreme, and then there's the, well, that's great that you're succeeding, I'm going to be a parasite mentality on the other side, right, at another extreme, and then there's something healthy in the middle.
And I like the idea of the emulation, that there's I would call a healthy relationship one that each partner is happy for the other's success, as well as uses that as maybe motivation to increase their own success, however they want to define that. Yeah,
and there's, again, this goes back to a great topic discussed in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. He, in Book 9, when he's discussing friendship, he talks about competition and whether it's okay to be self-loving, philautos in Greek. And he says that a lot of people say that if you're self-loving or selfish, that you're a bad person because of that. And he says, well, no, it depends on the kinds of things that it has to do with. So if it's things that really are kind of a zero-sum game, like money or honor or attention, if I get more of it, you get less of it. So if I desire to have more than my fair share, I'm depriving you, right? So I shouldn't be selfish in that respect. But when it comes to other things that can be shared, and if I possess, I'm not taking away from you, like moral virtue or wisdom, or really any of the things that are core to who we are, the fact that I do well by becoming courageous doesn't mean you become less courageous as a result, as if it somehow like flows out of you and into me, right? Instead, I can help you be more courageous. And if I share the knowledge that I have with you, it's not like it goes out of my head into your head, like we're copying files or something, right? Or actually rather moving files. Instead, we replicate something in somebody else. And so he says we should be in competition with each other to who can be the most virtuous. And if we do that, it's not going to hurt anybody because we're going to be doing good things. And I think that makes really good sense within a relationship. It doesn't mean that both partners have to like try to outdo each other and who can make the most money. That's probably not going to be helpful. But
then you're just participating in avarice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think we might want to move to practice here, or do
Yeah,
you still have more to talk about?
No, I think that wraps that up pretty well.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a practice here, which is speak without judging, which seems to be a very useful skill to have with your own partner. And so you should reserve, or the practice is to reserve judgment of things, for you do not have all the information about why they are doing it. Doubly so, speak without judgment to your partner.
So what would it be? What would be an example of speaking without judgment to your partner? A common case that we would run across.
A lot of times it's just try to avoid using the words like good or bad, and try to speak in the objective terms. So like calling someone that drinks too much, I guess you could say, he drinks too much instead of he drinks poorly, or he's a drunk, because then you are adding the emotional stigma of that is a negative thing, and it might actually come to negative outcomes. But in order to actually help that person move forward, they don't want to be labeled with the label of bad, but it is now, which is something that is an adjective to describe the person, and more to the point of describing the particular action, and the actions are a lot easier to change than a badness or goodness of a person.
So there's two good sides to this, right? There's the side of yourself, which is that you're not, by not labeling them, you're not going down all those trains of thought where you have to say, well, why am I even with this kind of person? Or I should do something to retaliate against this person, or I need to be on guard against this person who's always this way. People do often use always never language when it comes to these sorts of things. And then, like you said, when you're actually dealing with your partner, you can preclude pushing their buttons, right? Doing things that are going to keep them from hearing what you're genuinely bothered by and would like to see getting fixed in some way.
So another example of this would be like, say, your partner has just come back from a workout or a run or something, and now they've been sweating and they have a rank smell to them. And you say like, oh, you bathe poorly. No, they just you didn't. You weren't aware that they had just come back from some sort of workout, and so all of a sudden the initial impression that you're getting is just that they smell bad, and you can either say, hey, at this point in time, you might need to bathe, but not to say that you bathed poorly. Or
that you just have poor personal hygiene, right? Is how we would probably say it today. Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a really good example, because what it points to is, in many cases, going along with this, maybe what we need to do is get more information. If like we don't know that the person just got back from working out, they just come in and they plop themselves down on the couch, and we don't know that they're planning on taking a shower in half an hour or something like that. If we ask them questions, we can find out, you actually are going to deal with this. And there's so many other relationship things, I think, where people are quite worried that their partner isn't going to take this thing seriously or is going to act this way all the time, not realizing that it's a unusual situation,
Yeah, it kind of plays into the fundamental attribution error bias.
Well, say something about that, because that's not a term everyone's going to know.
Absolutely. And so the fundamental attribution error is the idea that you have in your mind that you have made decisions based on certain circumstances, but you're more predisposed to the idea that other people's decisions are based on their character.
Oh,
and
right.
So that,
yeah. And
so this, your partner works out, they're going to take a shower in a half hour, and so you think like, he's just a slob. Whereas he's like, yeah, but I had to do this thing before, I have a timeline, I have to do this, and am expecting to do that in a moment, whereas your partner might be thinking like, oh, he's just a slob and that is his character, and now I have to like reassess, do I actually want to be in a relationship with a person that's a slob?
Yeah, or do I want to like go after them and criticize them for their slobbishness? Now, here's a question. What do we do about people who genuinely are... they do have bad habits. They like, let's take the the example we were talking about before, the person who wants you to always be their ally and being angry against other people. I know I had a previous relationship like this, and it ended when I quit doing that. Mm-hmm. Within a week of saying, these people aren't as bad as you make them out to be, the relationship was finished. Because she wasn't getting out of it what she wanted. So what should we do when we've got partners who maybe they're good in other ways, but there are genuinely problematic aspects of their personality or their character? What would you say?
Well, yeah, as we spoke about earlier, it's the ability to have a good relationship is to a certain extent dependent upon their ability to not be a sycophant, to not always be the yes man that agrees with them, and to give them some blunt advice, at least in the way that you see that. And if they can't take that advice, it makes it really difficult to have a relationship in that regard. Yeah.
So there's kind of there's no like hard and fast rules for this. This is where prudence would come in, right?
Yeah. And it's going to be different for every person, and everyone's on a journey of their own life and trying to become a better person, hopefully.
Do you think it's helpful to have other people involved in the situation, giving advice, giving counsel, or, because of the intimacy of a relationship, the fact that people are looking in only through really limited windows, is it better to like keep them out?
I think if you don't have that ability to be candid, then there's a aspect of one relationship that I feel like you could definitely improve upon.
Yeah, that's that may be actually a great topic to pick up next time. I see we're getting close to the end of our hour. Any last thoughts?
Hopefully, I wish everyone good health within their relationship and whatnot. You?
Well, I had to have this really nice line by Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, who talks about genuine love as being two solitudes protecting and bordering and greeting each other. And I think that's like, it's the epitome of what we're talking about here, provided we understand what he means by solitude.
Thank you, Greg. And we leave you today with the words of Maya Angelou. If you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, change your attitude.